Good morning, you two, and welcome to World Book Day. Oh, right. Good morning, everyone. It is me, Mr. Twit here. You may recognise me from my own little book, The Twits. Me and my wife, Mrs. Twit. Will you turn that TV down? I've spent a lot of time arguing recently. This lockdown life has not been good for us. So, Mr. Egg has got me in today to help you with World Book Day, so we can talk about our love for books. The first thing I'd like to talk about is catching the bug, okay? And that's not the corona bug, that is catching the reading bug. And I want you to think about, why is reading a skill that is important to do well? Why do you like to read and why? What will reading allow you to do when you are older? And what types of texts do you really like to read? And why do you like to read them? Take a moment to think. Pause the video if you'd like to have a little discussion with someone. And then we'll come back to this question this afternoon. Now, today we are looking at Mr. Men books. Now, have a little think. Do you know the Mr. Men books? Have you heard them before? We've got Little Miss over here. We've got Little Miss Splendid, Mr. Tickle, Mr. Nosy, Mr. Noisy, Mr. Silly. That one looks a bit like Mr. Leg, doesn't it? And we've got Little Miss Chatterbox at the bottom. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you one of the Mr. Men books. Okay. And this one is all about Mr. Happy. On the other side of the world, where the sun shines hotter than here, and where the trees are 100 feet tall, there is a country called Happy Land. And as you might very well expect, everybody who lives in Happy Land is as happy as the day is long. Wherever you go, you see smiling faces all around. It's such a happy place that even the flowers seem to smile in Happy Land. And as well as the people being happy, all the animals in Happy Land are happy as well. If you've ever seen a mouse smile, or a cat, or a dog, or even a worm, go to Happy Land. This is a story about someone who lived there who happens to be called Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy was fat and round and happy. He lived in a small cottage beside a lake, at the foot of a mountain and close to a wood in Happy Land. One day, while Mr. Happy was out walking through the tall trees in those woods near his home, he came across something which was really rather extraordinary. There, in the trunk of one very tall trees, was a door. Not a very large door, but nevertheless a door. Certainly a door. A small, narrow, yellow door. Definitely a door. I wonder who lives there, thought Mr. Happy to himself, and he turned the handle of that small, narrow, yellow door. The door wasn't locked, and it swung open quite easily. Just inside the small, narrow, yellow door was a small, narrow, winding staircase leading downstairs. Mr. Happy squeezed his rather large body through the rather thin doorway and began to walk down the stairs. The stairs went round and round and down and down and round and down and down and round. Eventually, after a long time, Mr. Happy reached the bottom of the staircase. He looked around and saw, there in front of him, another small, narrow door, but this one was red. Mr. Happy knocked at the door. "Who's there?" said a voice, a sad, squeaky sort of voice. "Who's there?" Mr. Happy pushed open the red door slowly, and there, sitting on a stool, was somebody who looked exactly like Mr. Happy, except he didn't look happy at all. In fact, he looked downright miserable. Look at that sad face. "Hello," said Mr. Happy. "I'm Mr. Happy." "Oh, are you indeed?" sniffed the person who looked like Mr. Happy but wasn't. "Well, my name is Mr. Miserable, and I'm the most miserable person in the world." "Why are you so miserable?" asked Mr. Happy. "Because I am," replied Mr. Miserable. "How would you like to be happy, like me?" asked Mr. Happy. "I'd give anything to be happy," said Mr. Miserable. "But I'm so miserable, I don't think I could ever be happy," he added miserably. Mr. Happy made up his mind quickly. "Follow me," he said. "Where to?" asked Mr. Miserable. "Don't argue," said Mr. Happy, and he went out through the small, narrow, red door. Mr. Miserable hesitated and then followed. Up and up the winding staircase they went, up and up, and round and round, and up and round and round and up, until they came out into the wood. "Follow me," said Mr. Happy again, and they both set off through the wood back to Mr. Happy's cottage. Mr. Miserable stayed in Mr. Happy's cottage for quite some time, and during that time the most remarkable thing happened. Because he was living in Happyland, Mr. Miserable, ever so slowly, stopped being miserable and started being happy. His mouth stopped turning down at the corners, and ever so slowly, it started turning up at the corners. And eventually, Mr. Miserable did something that he'd never done in his life. He smiled, and then he chuckled, which turned into a giggle, which became a laugh. A big, booming, hearty, huge, giant, enormous laugh. Ha, 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 ha. And Mr. Happy was so surprised that he started to laugh, and both of them laughed and laughed. They laughed until their sides hurt and their eyes watered. Mr. Miserable and Mr. Happy laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed some more. They went outside and they still laughed. And because they were laughing so much, everybody who saw them started laughing as well. Even the birds in the trees started to laugh at the thought of somebody called Mr. Miserable who couldn't stop laughing. That is quite funny, isn't it? And that's really where the end of the story, except to say that if you ever feel as miserable as Mr. Miserable used to, you know exactly what to do, don't you? Just turn up your mouth at the corners. Go on. Have you met the other Mr. Men yet? Now, Harrietsham, take a moment, have a look at the different Mr. Men we've got there. It would be a good idea to pause because you could use them in your stories that we're going to write today. There's Mr. Leg, Mr. Funny. Okay, perfect. Now, let's go back to my slides I've got. Okay. And what I'd like you to do this morning is think about a story that you could write to do with the Mr. Men. Okay, we are going to invent our own new character. It could be Mr. Bookworm or Little Miss Bookworm. And this character loves to read books. I know how many of you love reading books as well. And they like to read books anywhere and everywhere. But they like to annoy the other characters with the amount that they talk about books. Your main character is going to teach the other characters the importance of reading and the opportunities that they can have if they are able to read well. First, we must design our main character and make sure they are holding books to emphasize how much they love reading. So, You should have a sheet in your packs. And what I'd like you to do on this sheet, Harrietsham, is I'd like you to draw your own main character. That is Little Miss Bookworm or Mr. Bookworm. It doesn't matter if you're a boy or a girl. You can choose whichever one you like. If you were a girl and you'd like to choose Mr. Bookworm, that's okay. If you're Little Miss Bookworm and you'd like to choose a Mr. Bookworm, that's okay too. So draw a lovely picture of your character. And then what you need to do is think about the other characters that are going to be in your story. What other Mr. Main characters could you include? Could you include Mr. Tickle, Mr. Funny, Mr. Miserable, Mr. Happy? Okay. And underneath the pictures, okay, underneath the pictures you draw just here, I would like you to write some description about each of those characters that you've drawn. Okay. And then we're going to use those characters as we go through the rest of the day. So that is our first task today. That is this morning. You got to draw a main character, Mr. Bookworm or Little Miss Bookworm, and then draw 3 other characters that are going to be part of your story. For now, it's goodbye from me and good luck. Have fun doing it, and I'll see you again in a little while.